incoming 8th graders. Um, this video is going to talk about your summer homework. And so, some things that you need to be aware of when you're doing it. But before I start, I do want to let you know that today at the award ceremony, I'm recording this on the last day of school. So, when you guys are getting your awards, I was passing out the awards to 7th grade, and then Sebastian comes up to me, and the first thing Sebastian says is, "You really got to stop making jokes at the beginning of your videos." And I know he didn't mean that, because even though he was wearing a mask, he had this smirk on his face, so I could tell that what he really meant when he said that was, please continue to make jokes in the videos. So I wasn't planning on including jokes in the summer homework videos, because there's only like 2 or 3 of them that are going to be made. But because Sebastian really insisted that I put more jokes in them, I decided to grant his request. So you guys know that Sebastian and I are neighbors, right? Like, we live seriously walking distance from each other. And he hasn't told you this the other day, but the other day I was listening to music at night, and for some reason I was like really into the band Oasis at that time. And I got a knock on the door. It was like 11 at night, and it was Sebastian. And Sebastian goes, "Please, Mr. Bruce, stop playing Oasis songs." And then I said, "Maybe." If you guys don't know the band Oasis, if you don't know their music, that joke would not have made sense. But trust me, that was funny. Um, anyways, Sebastian and I have this neighbor who is like buying a new car seems like every month this person buys a new car. So like recently I think he got like a BMW, and then before that he had like a new Lexus, and then he got like a F-150. He got a bunch of new cars recently. And I think he got the coronavirus virus. No? Maybe? What do you think? Yes? No? Maybe? I feel like most of you are probably going like this. This is a pretty good joke. Okay, so we're going to be learning about 2nd and 3rd John. Now remember, for these videos, it's the same thing that you would do in a regular class. The only difference is over the summer, you have until August to do this. And then in September, when we take our very first quiz, 2nd and 3rd John are going to be part of the quiz you take. So it's not a quiz on 2nd and 3rd John, but 2nd and 3rd John are going to be part of the material that you're responsible for. All right. So if you guys have already completed the questions that I posted, you've seen that 2nd and 3rd John are very, very short, right? They're extremely short epistles. They're part of what we would call the Catholic letters, because they're not written by St. Paul. They're part of those 7 letters that are not written by Paul. So there's a nickname for them called the Lesser Epistles. And they're not called Lesser Epistles because they're not as important. Remember, 2nd and 3rd John are still part of the Bible. That means they're still the inspired Word of God. So lesser just refers to their length, because they are extremely brief, right? We know that 2nd and 3rd John were written by the Apostle John, who, remember, was the author of the Apocalypse. He's the author of the Gospel of John. He's the author of 1st John. And we also know that he wrote 2nd and 3rd John at some point in the 90s, right? He would have, because we know 1st John was written at some point in the 90s. So these letters, 2nd and 3rd John, are called the Lesser Epistles because we want to contrast them or distinguish them from 1st John. Because 1st John, which we've already learned about, is significantly longer, right? Now, one big difference between 2nd and 3rd John and 1st John is 2nd and 3rd John does not include the author identifying himself. But we do know that John wrote these, even though John doesn't say he wrote these. We know John wrote these because this is what everyone thought when these letters were first sent out, right? Pretty much everyone who received these letters or a copy of these letters believed that the Apostle John was the author. So because everyone at that time believed that it was the Apostle John that wrote these, we believe that. And then there's another reason that we think that John's the author, and this is because we know that 2nd and 3rd John were written by the same person. And we know that 2nd John is very similar to 1st John. So we just connect the dots and conclude that John must be the author, right? Another reason we know John is the author, even though it doesn't have his name on them, is because these letters, even though they're very, very short and they don't have a lot of material in them, they spread really quickly and were treated with great importance by the early church, right? They don't contain any new teachings that are not present in John's other writings. But the fact that they're treated with such importance by the early church and the fact that they spread so quickly shows that whoever the author was revered as a very important leader of the early church. And of course, John at this time is the last living apostle, so this fits, right? This makes sense. And then the final reason that we know that 2nd and 3rd John was written by St. John is because both of these letters use language and turns of phrase that are also used in John's gospel. All right, so we have a lot of stylistic connection between 2nd and 3rd John and John's gospel. All right, so what about, what's the difference between 2nd John and 3rd John? So 2nd John, we believe, was probably originally a rough draft of 1st John. And because it's a rough draft of 1st John, that means it must have been written before 1st John, right? So that's how we know that that'll be relevant later. I'll get to that in a second. The reason we know it's written before 1st John is because it basically says the same thing that 1st John does. It's just in a less, I say a less intense way here, but that's not necessarily true. What I really mean is a less detailed way, right? So just like 1st John, 2nd John is a letter warning against false teachers and the dangers of the false teachers. And then, of course, it also, just like 1st John, encourages the Christian to practice caritas, which is impossible to do unless you obey God's commandments. Remember, in 1st John, the false teachers do not obey God's commandments, so therefore they don't practice caritas. Right now, 3rd John is a little bit different. Right? 3rd John is kind of like Acts of the Apostles. What do I mean by this? I mean, it talks about like personnel issues in the church and kind of how the early church worked, right? So just like 2nd John, it doesn't have any new teachings in it. 3rd John just talks about 3 different people, 3 different figures in the early church and what they're doing right and what's being done wrong. Right? Now, 3rd John, we don't really know when it was written. We don't know if it was written in the early 90s or the late 90s, but we think it was written sometime around 1st and 2nd John, and it was probably written actually before 1st John, although we're not sure. All right, we'll do one more, and then I'll stop this video. All right, so both of these letters have a very similar introduction and a very similar conclusion. I don't really care about the conclusions that much. I just want to focus on the introductions because that's more important. So in the ancient world, when a letter was written, and it was a formal letter, it followed a simple formula. So you would start off the letter by saying who you were. Now, I already said John doesn't identify himself by name in 2nd and 3rd John. Instead, he calls himself the elder, or in some translations, the presbyter, right? It means a church leader, like a bishop, right? So he calls himself the elder, right? And this suggests that whoever received the letter would have known who the author was, right? They would have known who the elder was, right? The elder is someone who is important, someone who is revered, right? That's the only explanation as to why he would call himself the elder instead of just saying John, right? Because he's just assuming that everyone who reads the letter knows who he is. Then the second thing you would do when you're writing a letter is you would include the person you're writing the letter to. This is called the addressee, right? So when we write letters, we sign our letters at the bottom, right? We don't say from Mr. Bruce to whoever, right? What we do is we say this letter, at the top of the letter, you say, dear so-and-so, and then you sign it at the bottom with your name, right? In ancient letters, they put both of these things together at the top of the letter. So who are the addressees? Well, 2nd John is addressed to someone called the elect lady and her children. And 3rd John is addressed to a specific person, a guy named Gaius. So we're going to talk about what both of those mean later on. And then finally, the way you signal that you're starting your letter is you have a greeting. So John includes a greeting at the start of both of these letters. Okay, so that's the formula for how ancient letters work. John mimics this formula in 2nd and 3rd John. The next video is going to be about 2nd John, and then we'll do a final video on 3rd John.